Very excited about our first presenter this morning. Pastor Evan McClanahan is a longtime friend of Lutherans for Life. He's originally from Shreveport, Louisiana. So he's a Southerner like you guys are. Baptized in 1981 at St. Luke's Methodist Church, but then a son of Holy Trinity Lutheran in Shreveport, where he was steeped in Lutheran liturgy and theology. Fell so much in love with that when he attended Centenary College in Louisiana, he took his BA in music. He then attended seminary at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, serving his vicarage at St. John Lutheran in Royal, Illinois. He met his wife, Amanda, in Chicago. They were married in 2006, and upon graduation from seminary, he was placed at Living Word Lutheran Church in Grapevine, Texas. Another great friend of Lutherans for Life. We've had a conference at that congregation as well. In 2009, he received the call to serve as pastor at First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas, which is where he and his family are today. He and Amanda have 2 kids. And Pastor, they're almost not kids anymore. It goes by really quick. And while serving there at Historic First, he has initiated several ministry, including an outreach to Houston Community College students, The First Word, that's a debate and lecture series, and he's even a podcaster. His podcast is called Theology on Air. His presentation today, we're super excited, is going to talk about the ways that the world describes biblical manhood. And then we're going to offer a competing alternative to that perception. But faced with the reality of a cultural revolution, the need for biblical men has never been greater, but also never as rewarding. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear Pastor Evan McClanahan.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. I can't live up to that introduction by any means. But before I begin, what does VDMA mean? You know, I'm standing here. I want to make sure it means something good, you know. So what is it?
The word of the Lord endures forever.
The word of the Lord endures forever. Okay, I can endorse that. Okay, good. Okay, I've been wondering. My Latin is, it's pretty non-existent, actually. Also, I just wanted to say I'm not a bum. Okay, I'm growing my beard back. Okay, it's not that I haven't shaved for 2 days. Okay, so there's a difference. Okay, that was a joke. Okay, also true. Anyway, yes, I'm Evan McClanahan, good German stock, obviously. I have a wife and 2 children. Those are my qualifications for being here, not much else. Okay, so has everyone seen the Lutherans for Life tip of the iceberg drawing? Y'all know what I'm talking about? They've made it famous. They should. You should all know it. Basically, it's an iceberg. Right at the tip is abortion, but underneath it are all the other pro-life things we have to consider. You know, euthanasia, some of which we'll talk about today. But, you know, something like biblical manhood and womanhood is a part of that. Sort of understanding what men and women are. And so, hence the topic today. It seems to be an area of confusion in the world. The world, never underestimate the world's ability to be confused about the most basic things. And so, I don't think that I'm going to say anything particularly revolutionary today, or I don't think I'll say anything any of you will disagree with. But maybe I can throw out a few things that will put you in a position to conversate with your maybe not Christian friends or not fully Christian friends yet on this topic. When they did ask me to speak of it, I will admit that I, of course, wanted to say no to that because I'm not a particularly manly man. I don't have a gym membership. I cannot bench press my own weight. I'm embarrassed to say that. I could if I really worked at it, but at the moment I can't. And I do not have a degree in gender studies. So what do I really know about men or women? And I also always feel like these questions are sort of self-evident. Do we really need to tell people what biblical manhood? Isn't it obvious? Doesn't everyone know this sort of thing? And then there's been this sort of interesting thing that has happened where there has been a kind of rise in speaking about being a man in reaction to feminism and toxic masculinity and all of that. There has been this rise in secular circles about, owning up to manhood, and yet a lot of what they say is wrong biblically, or it's sort of incomplete. So I thought, well, maybe we do need to look at this biblically. Maybe there is something that we have to say. My motivation for writing is my own 13-year-old son, right? And the anxiety that we all face as parents or as grandparents, etc., of what kind of world, they're growing up in. It's a very different world. It's a cliche to say it, but it's a very different world from the world I grew up in. When I was growing up, there was no internet. Well, of course, now the internet is a gateway to the worst possible things that the world has to offer. And try as I might, I'm not going to be able to shield that from him forever. In the world today, we can't even define what a man or a woman is, right? So, he has no problem with that, but that's the world he is growing up in. In this world, I don't trust really public schools or almost any college or university. Sorry. Maybe there's some good Concordias out there still. We'll look into that. But my trust level is virtually non-existent these days with most education. And, he has, because we've sheltered him for his own safety, a lot less coming of age sort of organic experiences that I did. In my day, right, my parent would let us ride around on the bike. There was probably a 1 mile radius, right, where we could go from the house, and we were pretty much left alone, come home at night sort of thing. I would never do that. Never do that. Now I have the city's pedophile map, right? And I'm like, oh, they live in my neighborhood. In fact, they all congregate at that apartment over there, And I don't live in a slum, but this is the world. This is the world that we live in. Y'all probably think, oh my, who did you ask to speak here? Is this some kind of crazy person you picked up off the street? And obviously, I'm hoping this changes, but if he is an outspoken conservative Christian, that places him in a minority. That wasn't really the case when I was a kid. That was sort of the norm. But those are also, the world is sort of changing, obviously, and so I've thought about with this question, what would I want him to sort of know or think about? So there's a lot to consider. And I didn't want to soft pedal this whole thing. I wanted to push boundaries a little bit. I hope to offend a few of you today, kindly, but push a couple of questions, or else what's the point? I wanted to begin though with some bad examples of manhood, not biblical manhood, but what is sort of passed off as manhood today. So I want to ask if you've heard of any of these popular figures, influencers, etc. Has anyone ever heard of the Tate brothers? Tate brothers? Who are the Tate brothers? Y'all know?
They do popular podcasts, and one of them I think is he actually recently converted to Islam.
Yes, yeah, Andrew Tate, and I think they. Okay, long story. I'll make it quick. Their father was like a chess player or something, and they kind of got into fitness. I think he's a kickboxer, Andrew Tate. They got in a lot of trouble in Romania because they owned, we have children in the room, so a less than savory internet business. They think they were wrongfully imprisoned. Now that Donald Trump won on Tuesday, Andrew Tate says he's moving back to America. They have a huge following. That's the bottom line. If you don't know who they are, you should, because your grandchildren might really look up to them because they're in shape and they drive Bugattis and fly in private planes. But yes, Andrew Tate recently converted to Islam because Christianity's version of masculinity is, according to them. So this is sort of what we're up against. There could be, I think it's unlikely, but there could be a whole slew of young men in America who look at Christian masculinity as subpar, and they will go to Islam because they will fight for things or something like that. Anyway, so if you don't know who the Tate brothers, that is a widely popular understanding of manhood that is, by definition now, not biblical. Who has ever, this is more obscure, who's ever heard of the book Bronze Age Mindset? You get bonus points for that one. Fairly big Twitter follow these days. I've unfollowed him because I found it far too secular and worldly for me. But the basic idea, is that this guy kind of promotes this understanding of masculinity that's like, let's go back to the Bronze Age where we made things and we kind of, it's definitely, what do you call it when you look down, misogynistic, you know, to a wrong degree. But these are the kinds of people that will influence young men for sure. How about the Fresh and Fit YouTube channel? Anyone ever heard of that? Fresh and Fit. Huge young male following. Once again, you know, they encourage you to eat vegetables and stay in shape. And more. Experiment, if you might. Say, be with lots of women. That's part of your young malehood, right? Understanding who you might be compatible with. Okay, trying to keep this PG rated here. But that they have a pretty huge following as well. And these are all people see creeping into the conservative space, right? Here's a big one. How about Joe Rogan? Yeah, we've all heard of Joe Rogan by now, right? I'm hoping. He's all right, I guess. Not a Christian. Definitely in the man space, right? Definitely definitional of what it is to be a man. Huge following there. Moving, I would say, piece by piece in our direction, broadly speaking. In fact, that's a kind of interesting trend where I think you're starting to seeing some of these politically, socially, culturally conservative, kind of intuitively conservative personalities and influencers. You do see some of them embrace Christianity explicitly more and more, or they're outright converting to Christianity. There's some positive signs. Of course, that makes sense because the more conservative you get, you realize that it's God's world we live in, it's God's laws that the world is ruled by, and Christianity is the only thing that explains anything at all, including, of course, virtue and morality and such. So I think those are some good signs. Tucker Carlson would be another example. In fact, at the last one of these I gave, conferences we had, a woman came up and said, I don't know about that Tucker Carlson guy, though. He's a little crazy. He's a little off the rails. Well, he may be, but I will say that he has gone from a nominal Episcopalian to an outspoken Christian. He even said something about being attacked by a demon a while back. I don't know what I think about that, but it's interesting. How about the Paul brothers? Jake and Logan Paul. Yeah, big fight this weekend on Netflix. Jake Paul is fighting Mike Tyson. I think there's a 70-year age difference between the two. Bizarre. The boxing matches they put together are really weird. I tell you, it's gotten really bizarre out there. Anyway, these guys, I think, were Disney kids growing up. I didn't watch Disney when I was a kid, but these two brothers, and then they kind of became YouTubers and pranksters, but over time they've kind of gotten red-pilled, you might say. They've gotten more and more conservative. But, not exactly who I'd want my son to look up to. Maybe could be worse, but seem to be pretty worldly and secular these days. Okay, now more on the intellectual side. Who's heard of Jordan Peterson? Okay, all right. So, huge influence with young men. Oh, he has a lot of nice things to say about Jesus, right? So for that, I'm happy. He's another one of these guys that's like getting close. It's like the inevitability of Christianity. He's right there on the edge. In fact, I believe his wife and daughter converted to Catholicism. Close, anyway. So there's interesting movement on these fronts. I find pretty interesting. But all of those people and many more that I'm unaware of because I'm not that plugged in. These are all presenting images of manhood that your sons and grandchildren will be very influenced by. And they might think that they can get all the benefits of this masculinity or manhood without Christ. And indeed, Christ, because he's such a nice guy and all, he might come to be seen as weak in a time where we need a robust, virile masculinity to combat the forces of feminized liberalism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it. So, and interestingly, as I kind of looked over the speech this week, I thought a lot changed this week. I don't know if y'all know there was an election this week, and it's been interesting to watch. One of the trends, for example, is that more men voted, and a lot more women voted for a conservative ticket, if you will. So there are some changes going on in the culture around these very issues, and the election kind of ended up being a touchstone on that. But what's basically happening is that as men were treated as villains, there's been a gut kind of reaction against that, and it's not always a good thing. It's not always a terrible thing. Like I said, there's movement in the right direction in many cases, but a lot of these male influencers are vulgar. They're very worldly. They openly promote promiscuity. I mean, very openly promote that. So the Christian understanding of manhood does, it is needed. It is very much needed. Meanwhile, we don't always get this right because we tend to pander to men. Anybody know the stats on the women participation in church compared to men? I've seen different numbers. I've seen 55-45, 60-40, but think about your average Sunday morning. It's almost certainly more women than men. It's a question of, how much. But, we probably all know women who bring their children to church while the husband stays at home, or single women or widows who come on their own. It's a good sign if your church is, balanced, is equal. That would be a good sign of health. But one of the things you'll see, for example, I don't know if they do this anymore. I remember years ago it was a trend where the pastor would try to drive a motorcycle into the church. Y'all ever seen those videos? There's one on YouTube with a poor guy crashing quite badly. So he's okay, but you don't need to prove you're a man by driving a motorcycle. Okay, that doesn't make you a man. Or there was this is a lot less innocuous, but it's in the same ballpark, where there was a church in Missouri that hosted a car show on Father's Day. Now, I happen to own a 1977 MGB. I mean, I like old cars. I think they're pretty cool. But it's kind of like pandering. It's like, well, what do we know about men? Well, they like cars, so let's do a car show. And you might get the dad who doesn't otherwise go to church kind of show up for the car show in the parking lot, and then maybe you hope to build a relationship, and then maybe one day you get around to presenting the gospel. I'm not sure how successful those sorts of strategies are. There was one church where a pastor flew into a sanctuary. It's like a gimmick, like he flew in from the back on some kind of string or something. Anyway, these are all sort of bad versions of masculinity. That's kind of my point. But before we get to sort of what is a good definition of a biblical masculinity, I think we have to address, and I don't know if this is an elephant in the room in this room, but it might be in some rooms, but we have to ask a very fundamental question first, which is, can Christians say that while men and women are truly of equal value and worth and dignity, are they fundamentally different? Now again, I don't think this should be a particularly controversial idea among biblical Christians, but it kind of is, and it's something that we need to be comfortable answering. It might be the first touchstone of a conversation that we're having. Basically, the question is this: can we say that men have particular roles and duties as men, right? Roles and duties that women cannot fulfill. Can we say that men are made so differently from women, generally, if not universally, that it could actually be an offense to God to confuse the roles of men and women? I believe the answer to that must be yes, if we are to be faithful biblical Christians. If we are going to even try to define biblical manhood or biblical womanhood, we first have to agree that God made men and women different. And there are things that are precluded, in a normal circumstance, from men and women doing. Now, in ancient times, this didn't really need to be explained. Everyone sort of knew what a man or a woman was, and men should do the hard, dirty work, and women should, sort of raise children. And of course, there's some overlap. I think fathers should be very active in raising children. And there are times when women need to do manual labor, etc. But generally speaking, the ancient world understood this. Who's seen the film, the Matt Walsh film, What is a Woman? Yeah. Might have won conservatives the election. You know, when you take a step back, I mean, one of the major driving motivators for people was men should not be in women's sports. Not really an election issue 4 years ago. Became an election issue this year. It's, of course, transcends politics, of course. But my favorite scene in the film is when Matt Walsh goes to Africa and he tries to explain, you know, the transgender movement to a famous tribe in Kenya. And they are very confused as to this concept of men becoming women or women becoming men. Why would you would cut off what exactly? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that correctly. Something's lost in translation. But most cultures simply, still to this day, around the world, who was it that said, I think it was George Orwell that said, that's an idea so stupid you'd have to go to university to believe it, or something. So most cultures understand, and obviously historically understood, that, you know, men, for example, are on the whole physically stronger, and therefore they bear certain responsibilities that women should not and cannot bear. And women, generally speaking, have gifts from God as well, nurturing, childbearing, etc., and that men cannot fulfill these roles either. And so this all used to be pretty clear to us. These are physical realities, and nothing has changed. So I would say if we deny those realities, if we want to confuse the equation of men and women in terms of their worth before God as to then, therefore, this, is it egalitarian point of view, to where they're therefore equal in every other way. That's a logical fallacy, a form of insanity, and it's just, that's kind of where we need to plant our flag. I participate in a ministry in Houston. It's called Theology by the Pint. We have conversations, maybe 100, 150 people show up. We have food and beer. It's okay to drink beer in moderation. But we have a panel discussion, kind of a debate format. It's fun. And we had this question of women in ministry come up. And two women sort of debated the question. And it was interesting. There was amicable dialogue. There was a panel discussion. There were debates about Greek words. There was conversation about what a deaconess is versus an ordained pastor. There was conversation about what Paul meant by women should be silent in the church, and in context of Ephesians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at no point was it just stated, as a matter of fact, that men and women are different. They are different in the eyes of God. So there are some roles that men should have that women should not, and some roles that women should have and men should not. And if you're not willing to just say that and start the conversation there, then everything else you say is going to be foolish. Everything else is just going to be a waste of time. You could say that and come to the conclusion that women should be in ordained ministry, but you have to make that case. You have to start, though, with saying that men and women are profoundly different. And that's okay. That's a good thing. God made us that way. It's all positive. And no one's taking anything away from anybody. It's all good. It's all positive. It's all lovely. But this is the way that God made us. Okay, biblical manhood. We're finally ready to tackle this. Okay. To answer this question, we need to look to the Bible. It's right there in the phrase, right? Biblical manhood. Okay, so we're not going to be looking to sociology or to psychology, and that's kind of a throwaway line, but one of the problems the Christian church faces is that we do always go to these other disciplines, which are not wholly bad, but they're incomplete. That's a whole rant I won't go on, but we're not going to even look at biology for this. We're going to look at the Bible. Now, there's not a chapter in 1 Corinthians somewhere that says, here's what biblical manhood is. Again, they sort of assumed it. They didn't have to write it out for us quite so clearly. The question for me was, well, which man in the Bible? There's lots of men in the Bible. So do we sort of look at all the men, and do we say, well, let's do Noah. We'll make Noah the perfect man. Of course, he wasn't the perfect man, right? He liked to drink a little. We saw that. Or, we could look at David. David's a pretty good man. Also not a perfect man. Peter, John. I mean, which man do you choose as sort of the ideal man that you base biblical manhood on? Maybe we just skip all of that and go to Jesus. The difficulty there is that none of us are God in human flesh, so it's a pretty high standard, one to which we aspire but will never attain. So do we kind of use a case study approach where we look at biblical men, look at hallmarks and characteristics and do that? Or do we look at what the Bible says sort of about men? Because there are parts of the Bible that, only deal with men. There are things that are exclusive to men. What is unique, this is really the question, about being a man in God's world as opposed to being a woman in God's world? Both men and women, for example, are told not to steal, right? We all have to obey the law. We're not to kill. We're not to commit adultery. We're not to lie. We're not to covet. There are many laws in the Bible that, of course, deal with both men and women. Both men and women are to honor God. They're to honor their elders. So what does the Bible say specifically only to men? Well, I'm going with a catch-all approach to try to put all this together, sort of case studies and things specific to men, etc. Obviously, I think the thing that jumps out most of all is that men are leaders. So that's going to be number one on the list. Men are leaders. They are leaders in the household. They are leaders on the battlefield. And they are leaders in the arena or area of spiritual warfare. Now, I don't see this as a demotion to women, although obviously worldly feminism would say that it is. How dare you say that I cannot lead, etc., etc. But really, I hate to say it, guys, but leadership is a burden. It's not a lot of fun. And men fail at this a lot when they do not lead. So just because you're a man doesn't mean you're a biblical man either. But leadership is a burden. And yet, in the Bible, what I see is that men must provide for their family. They must be the ones fighting the wars. They must lead congregations, as we would call it in our day, or Old Testament gatherings, etc. They literally do the heavy jobs, the heavy lifting, the dirty jobs that civilization requires. Somewhere on my Twitter feed is a bookmark that gives the percentages of men that do things like, installing cables, or construction, or it was a whole line of difficult, muscular jobs that really only men can do. Now, we're talking like mid to high 90% of men fulfilling those roles. Now, meanwhile, 99% of all preschool teachers are women. So, nature is healing, as they say. Now, one of the things that'll happen is people say, well, but men can become domineering brutes, right? This is the problem with men leading, is that they abuse their power and they harm people in the process. Well, a domineering brute is not a biblical man either. Okay, so the beauty of the Bible is that it empowers us and it limits us all at the same time. Indeed, Jesus says to those who would say, I'm a man, I'm leading, you do what I say, in some kind of brutalistic fashion. What does Jesus say? Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus immediately quashes this notion that to be a biblical man, to have a place of leadership, means you get to dominate or domineer over other people. Jesus himself went to the cross, right? Jesus himself was a slave and a servant to his people. So guys, sorry. That's not what leadership means. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. Men bear the responsibility of leadership. As I said, in three areas in particular: in the household, on the battlefield, and in spiritual warfare. Paul writes in Ephesians 5, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior." Hoping all pastors use that for premarital counseling. It should at least be mentioned. somewhere along the way. Of course, this does not give men the right to control women or abuse them. We'll see later it's quite the contrary. But it does mean that the men are the leaders of the family. And that might look different in different households. And in our household, it's kind of like everything is 50-50, but I'm the tiebreaker, you know. I do a lot of vacuuming. Okay, vacuuming is my thing. Okay. I do a lot of cooking. I do a lot of grocery shopping. Do a lot with the kids, etc. But if the time ever comes where it's like, I think it's time to move, to Florida. If it's like maybe, it's sort of what I say will be the decision point on that, If men lead the family, though, they are expected to provide for their wife and children, to sacrifice for them, to labor without complaint, and to protect them when necessary. So, guys, we have a lot on our plate for all of that. This concept of women fighting on the battlefield is, I hope you all know, completely bizarre to the Bible, right? The Bible would never conceive of some situation where women are in the military. That's a question I think we have to answer right now. I mean, it wasn't but maybe a couple of years ago that Congress passed a law. I don't know if it got through the Senate, but I think it got through the House, that women would be eligible to be drafted for combat. I think it's sort of dead in the water.
You're already in combat positions.
Yes, yeah. And then you get into hairy situations where it's like, well, I'm okay with women being in the military in, say, supportive or administrative roles. What kind of constitutes a battle? Is it being in a zone, like in being in the country of Syria, or is it literally being, in the trench, so to speak, going house to house? Anyway, I'll just say that I think it's insane that we would arm women to fight battles, and the fact that we have gotten there as a civilization, as a country, is a form of insanity. So, was I clear enough on that? I don't know. But men, by virtue of being the stronger sex, must fight war's battles if the choice is to fight or die. By the way, how about we just kind of have no war? I don't know. How about that? How about we have no standing army? That's I said I was going to try to be controversial. There's a controversial idea. Israel is commanded to have no standing army. That's a command from God himself. Because you know what happens when you have standing armies? They get bored. And the generals want to go blow stuff up, And that's what you do. You go look for wars to fight. When you have to rouse the militias together to go fight an absolutely necessary war, you do it. But you do it sort of, you have to leave the farm and the shop to the side to do it, and it's a huge sacrifice, so you don't want to do it too often. So maybe there we go. We can think about that. Spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare, when the church is doing what it's supposed to be doing, is like just everyday life. Your pastor, or if you are a pastor, you know that you are under assault by the devil. What is was it in 1 Peter 3, or 1 Peter 2? The devil, like a lion, is always roaring, looking for someone to devour. Right? So spiritual warfare is a reality, even in the Lutheran Church, even where we have things all sort of calm and figured out, and we have our liturgies every week, and we don't, step on too many toes or anything. Spiritual warfare is a real thing. And the devil has every intention of destroying the work of the gospel, of proclamation, of healing, of forgiveness, of community building, all of that in the name of Jesus that we do. The devil doesn't want any of that to happen. And so pastors are going to find themselves under scrutiny and under temptation and under threat. Do we want women to have to face that scrutiny? Is that a manly thing to do? Here you go. We'll just feed you to the lions. So of course I am in a denomination that ordains women. I don't know if anyone's going to be watching this, but might get in some trouble. I think it's something we have to rethink. And this is the primary reason, I would say, in addition to elders never being described as female. But in addition to that, we are literally saying to women, go ahead, You shoulder the burden of the spiritual warfare that you will face as a leader of Christ's people. I don't think that's very manly in a biblical way. So, now, in terms of politics and business and civic life, I think all those areas get a lot more murky, right? We see like Lydia in the New Testament's an entrepreneur. She makes her royal garments, purple garments. I don't see any critique of that. I don't see Paul saying, "What are you doing, woman? How dare you own a business?" So women seem to have some autonomy in that regard. Women vote, women run for office. We just had a woman running for president, in fact. I don't know if y'all noticed that or not. Interestingly, as has been pointed out by other people, there's this huge paradox in the world of we can't define a woman, and yet she was going to be the first woman president. That's a cliched joke at this point, but true. So I don't know what I think about politics or civic life or some jobs for women. I think some of what I said about the other vocations is the same, that corporate America can be as rapacious as a military job, and that's maybe not best for women. Y'all familiar with the trad wife movement, right? The women with, I saw a family here with 4 beautiful children today. Are they all girls? Yeah, okay. This speech has nothing for you then. I'm sorry. But yeah, no, one day they'll grow up and marry men, right? So, you want them to be biblical men. But I don't know the answers to the questions of the degree to which we ought to be placing women in positions as men. I'm probably getting a little more conservative on that for some of those same reasons, that men need to be shouldering the burden and protecting women from the hostilities of the world and some of those things. Not that women can't do those things or aren't as smart or capable as those things. And it might be a case-by-case basis. I'm just saying, maybe what I'm saying is that men should be giving women the option a little bit more than we are. That's all. But I think biblically speaking, we couldn't prohibit women from doing all those things. And by the way, just because a man is doing something doesn't mean he does it well or biblically. Has anyone ever, you don't have to raise your hand, this is rhetorical. Has anyone ever known a lousy male pastor? My congregation, they all know one, right? So anyway, there is this problem on the other side of kind of misogynistic point of view where it's like, well, because a man is doing it, it's being done well. No, men are held to a biblical standard. So if men fulfill these roles, they still have to do it biblically. The fact that they are male is just kind of gets you in the door, so to speak. But there are still high standards that the Bible would say. Okay, so those are the areas of leadership. These will all go much faster. Again, I hope are quite intuitive to you. Men are workers. Of course, women work extremely hard. Everyone knows that raising children is among the most difficult and rewarding jobs you will ever do, if that's what a woman chooses to do. Feminism has kind of done this weird thing with women where they have to do everything. They actually, they're never given a break because they have to be super moms and super corporate women and civic leaders as well, So it's kind of unfair to women that that's happened. Anyway, men are workers. For men, they don't have a choice. They have to work. It's just, sorry, the Bible says so. Biblical men cannot and must not be a non-worker. Paul chastises the men in Thessalonica for being non-workers. Now, they thought Jesus was coming again soon. That's kind of the issue of Thessalonians, is that, oh, Jesus is coming. I'm going to chill and just wait for the day. It's going to happen anytime. And Paul's like, no. You have to get up and get a job. You have to work. He says, we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more and to aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. Then in Proverbs, one of the greatest Bible verses of all time, the lazy man, and this happens a lot in Proverbs, the lazy man is mocked, right? But in Proverbs 22 it says, the sluggard says, there is a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets. This is like the dog ate my homework times a million, right? Like, I can't go to work. There's a lion in the street, right? So the point is that a lazy person will come up with any excuse not to work. Now, in South Carolina, I hear there are monkeys in the streets. So, maybe take a few days off there. We don't need an outbreak or whatever is going on there. Anyway, and look, a well-deserved retirement or sabbatical, or the seventh-day rest is all biblically commanded and okay. But generally speaking, right, men cannot be lazy. Men must work. Now, this is a negative, the third point. A biblical man does not need to be some kind of physical specimen. And this actually does, go back to the kind of manly examples we see in the influencer community. I mean, I am a little jealous of Joe Rogan's physique. I'm not going to lie. I mean, the tattoos I could do without, but he spends a lot of time in the gym and it shows, and I'm a little jealous, and I really need to get off the couch more. But y'all might know the story of Zacchaeus. Right? He was a wee little man, a tax collector. Someone is going right to the vocational aspect of it. I was thinking of his size and stature. He's a small little man. He has to climb up in the tree. And, and of course he is won over by Christ, you might say, or the Spirit of God wins him over, more accurately, to Christ. And he, as a taxpayer, he was unjust in asking for taxes. So if you recall, he repays. He offers to repay anyway, fourfold, all those who he has wronged. And so what makes Zacchaeus a biblical man is not his big athletic prowess as a man, but rather it's his humility to confess that he has sinned before God, and it is his remarkable accountability. So part of being a biblical man is being like Zacchaeus. You don't have to be a great athlete, but you do need to be honest and humble and accountable for what you have done that is wrong. 4, biblical men build each other up. They build one another up, and they make it in... Now, this would, of course, apply to men and women, but it certainly applies to men. In humility, count others more significant than yourselves. That's, of course, Philippians. And men maybe need to pay special account of that. We have these things called egos. And men kind of have profound egos, and men have pride, maybe a little more naturally or intuitively than women. And so I think Paul's admonition there is especially important to men to be humble. Just because men are the stronger sex, they bear more responsibility than women, they are never to use that power in a sinful way. Or consider Paul's admonition to fathers. He says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Right? So that's an explicit command to biblical men. So biblical men pay attention to their children. They do not mercilessly or abusively discipline them, but they patiently raise them and teach them. They draw out, therefore, the best of them. We heard this morning about the necessity of discipline. So that's in part of how we draw the best out of them. And then finally, men are to build up their wives and other women in their life. We've already spoken of how men are to protect and provide for their wives. But in the example of Jesus and Paul, we see biblical men lifting women up to unusual heights. While not elevated, perhaps, to the rank of apostle or elder, women were entrusted with the proclamation of the gospel and, of course, many acts of service in the life of the church. Only a woman receives this accolade, for example, from Jesus. "And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." So Jesus is not afraid to lift up women. Jesus is saying that the memory of this particular woman's act of washing his feet will be remembered forever. A few other examples as well. Y'all have heard of Priscilla and Aquila, right? These are followers of Paul, quite important in the early church. Priscilla is a woman, sometimes called Prisca. That's her nickname, I guess. So it's interesting that she is named first in this pair, Priscilla and Aquila. Normally the man would be named first. But Priscilla, maybe the theory is that she was perhaps a noble woman of some kind, a woman of means. And so she was of higher social rank than Aquila. And so therefore she is mentioned first. And that's an interesting little tidbit. Paul welcomes the ministry of many women, obviously, if you read the epistles, as he plants and builds churches. Some are listed in Philippians and Romans 16. They don't always get along. That's an occasion. Is it Euodia and Syntyche, I think, that are arguing in Philippians or Philippi? Jesus, of course, receives many women as disciples as well. Even in the Old Testament, women would have had more rights and freedoms and responsibilities than neighboring pagans afforded their wives. Greek and Roman women weren't treated all that well. So even when everyone says, oh, the Old Testament, those terrible people, they're so patriarchal, by all accounts, well, for one thing, God doesn't ask women to kill their own children and burn them off to Molech or something. So the Old Testament's pretty elevatory towards women. And then, of course, the creation story itself. Last conference we had biblical womanhood. The woman who wrote the pamphlet for that spoke, and she talks a lot about Adam and Eve. But you see that Eve is a partner to Adam. Again, elevated, not a second-class citizen by any means. So women, in other words, men build up women. That's part of our calling as biblical men. Finally, I want to share a portion from a recent sermon. And in our lectionary, do y'all do the 1 year or the 3 year here? The 1 year. Yeah, you're like really old school if you go back to the 1 year, We're still using the heretical RCL, But James came up, and in James, the famous teaching from James that it is the Christian imperative, the duty, that true religion is caring for widows and orphans. And that sermon ended up reflecting some of the same thoughts that I had for this talk. So I just want to share some of those thoughts because it ends up being a commentary on kind of men and women at large. In the old world, women and children were vulnerable because men could easily disappear. Right? Men might go off to work and just never come home. Men did very dangerous jobs. They might die in a mine or any number of things. Think of all the diseases that they could have easily gotten or injuries for which there would be no antibiotics or good surgical procedures. Of course, there was all the garden variety sorts of sins that might make men disappear as well. Adulteries or divorce or separation. So it's no wonder that women often found themselves alone or as orphans, or children would find themselves as orphans, or women might find themselves as widows. Survival in the ancient world was not some kind of divine human right. It was just sort of what happened if you didn't die that day, right? So there were no welfare programs other than slavery, but not like we think of it. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicaid. Don't worry, we're not going to have either one of those before long either. But anyway, so these Christians, they were changed by the love of Christ and given this example, of course, of Christ going to the cross to follow, and they gravitated to help those in need. And who was in most need? Of course, widows and orphans. While everyone else would quite literally leave the vulnerable out to die. Oh, sorry, kid, we didn't want to have you. We're going to put you off on the side of the road and let you cry yourself to death. Christians would not do that. They did not do that. So pure and undefiled religion is caring for those who could not care for themselves. Now, it's sort of interesting that widows and orphans have a lot of competition. The victim matrix is loaded these days. There are so many more victims these days. Minorities of all kinds now are sort of default victims. The poor are seen as victims. I live, by the way, in inner city Houston, so this is something I deal with. I walk out the door of the church, and these are things I deal with, so I'm a little frosty about it. LGBTQ people, of course, are victims. The homeless are victims. Drug addicts are victims. Even criminals are said to be victims. It's kind of this bizarre inversion of the natural order of things. pretty much, as far as I can tell, the only people in America today who are not victims are those who work hard, obey the law, pay confiscatory taxes, and, keep the society going. In other words, the people doing all the hardest work, they're not victims at all. And they're not. But I hope you see the kind of ironic point I'm trying to make. In fact, those people who do work hard and do pay all those taxes, they're often told that they're the problem because they're the oppressor. Not everyone who is down on their luck reaches widow or orphan status, however. In fact, there remains, as far as I can tell, no reason for a man shy of some kind of serious disability or unforeseen circumstance that would put them in a victim category. I just can't think of many. I mean, a war injury or, again, a disability of some kind, but I just don't see biblically where men fall into this camp. The Bible says pure and undefiled religion is caring for widows and orphans. And so what I propose then is that there should be very few ministries that churches offer for men in the way that we offer them for widows and orphans. Now, I think we should have men's breakfasts, and we should encourage men. In fact, that's the chief thing the church should be doing these days, is saying, thank you. Thank you for working your fingers to the bone. Thank you for being providers for your family. Thank you for being faithful to your family. But other than that, men don't really get to go to the church and say that they are victims. If that's the case, how might ministries look different? Well, I would say, for example, that food and shelter donations would be reserved for women and children. That men are turned away at the outset. 2 blocks from our church is a very liberal ministry that does lots of homeless ministry. They enable homelessness. They feed the homeless. They basically say, continue to be homeless as long as you want. We will foot the bill. I think that's a form of insanity, but that's the world we live in. There is a line of men, and it's mostly men, line of men at the beginning of every day to show up to get their free stuff. And across the street recently, they were doing a massive construction project where they were putting big 12-foot sewer lines or something under the street or something. And of course, it was all 10 or 12 men working to do that. And I thought, wow, this is it right here. This is the insanity of modern America right here. Men lining up because they're told they're victims, not working, not fulfilling their vocations, and across the street are men doing the very jobs they should be doing. So I would say Christian ministry would actually, again, unless it's a severe disability or something like that, if a man shows up for help, we say, no, actually, we have a ministry to widows and orphans, and you're not either one of those. Of course, a young man can be an orphan, obviously, but you get the point. I would say the church should become the sole provider of social relief, ending the government's near monopoly on charity and returning all of that tax money. We can dream, right? Obviously, it goes without saying that biblical men should be unabashedly, unashamedly pro-life because the unwanted unborn are, at least unwanted by their human parents, are definitionally orphans. We should create or support job training for widows or perhaps women abandoned by their husbands. We should, in a perfect world, completely repeal the sexual revolution which leads to orphans and, if not widows, a whole lot of single mothers. Interestingly, in the wake of the election this week, anybody see the 4B movement? I think that's what it's called. Y'all see this? It's women committing to no relations with men. I think maybe no birth control, no marriage, no pregnancy, something like that. And they're shaving their head live on TikTok or what have you. Y'all seen this? You haven't seen this yet? Yes, they're protesting, you see. They're protesting. And of course, as Christians are going, oh, okay, so you believe that that activity should be reserved for marriage? Okay. Your conditions are acceptable, right? Anyway, maybe the repeal of the sexual revolution will just happen organically because it's obvious it's been such a failure. But and then I think, I don't have the answers to this. I think we should maybe rethink the way we got rid of orphanages, and we should maybe do a deep dive into the foster system, which does a lot of good, but I think it's a lot of private things that are maybe not so good that I do worry about. So anyway, I just don't know about that. Anyway, to conclude, a lot of our problems would be solved if men were biblical men. I'm encouraged by some of the movement in that general direction socially, but there's a lot of holes missing in that secular understanding of manhood. Men and women who are both called to be biblical are alike in many respects. We follow the same laws. We're to be virtuous, obedient, and faithful, and gracious. But men and women are different. And despite the radical and absurd claims by those in our own day who possess an unbiblical worldview, men and women are different. And that means that our roles will be different, and that is okay. To the extent that men are uniquely called to lead, that is a bit of a burden for them, but it's also a privilege, and a privilege that cannot be abused. Rather than warring against the patriarchy, we should be supporting men who faithfully lead in a biblical manner. The world is telling them that they are the root cause of so many problems, and that is leading to a withdrawal from leadership or a truncated view of manhood. But loving and supporting men would be a great way to helping them become the biblical men they are called to be. Thank you all very much for your time today.